Rome did not hold its empire together with roads alone, or armies alone, or law alone. It held it together with trust. Trust that soldiers would be paid, trust that taxes collected in one province would still mean something in another. Trust that a merchant unloading cargo at a distant port was receiving value, not just metal stamped with authority. That trust had a shape. It was small, round, silver. At the height of Roman power, a coin helped do what armies alone could never do. It turned conquest into coordination. It turned territory into economy. It turned imperial reach into daily life. Because empires are not sustained by force alone. They are sustained when enough people across enough distance agree on what counts as value. And that agreement can survive many things. War, succession struggles, corruption, distance, but not indefinitely. Because the most dangerous moment in monetary history is not when a currency openly collapses. It is when it still looks strong enough to use, while quietly losing the substance that made people trust it in the first place. The emperor's image remains. The official value remains. The coin still moves through the empire as if nothing has changed. But inside, the silver is being taken out. And once a state learns it can remove metal while preserving appearances, it is no longer just changing money. It is changing the behavior of merchants, the expectations of soldiers, the flow of taxes, and eventually the stability of the society that depends on all of them. That is where Rome's first great inflationary crisis begins. Not with panic, not with collapse, but with a coin that still looked like order, after it had already begun to weaken it. The larger Rome became, the more it depended on stable money. Not just strong money, predictable money. An empire stretched across provinces, languages, climates, and frontiers could not run on force alone. It needed soldiers who believed their pay would still matter when it reached them. It needed merchants who believed silver received in one port would still hold value in the next. It needed tax collectors, governors, creditors, and households to live inside the same measure of worth. That was the paradox. Expansion increased Rome's power, but expansion also increased its hunger. More borders to defend, more roads to maintain, more officials to pay, more grain to move, more loyalty to secure. And the greater that pressure became, the stronger the temptation inside the state. Because once a government controls the mint, it controls more than metal. It controls the standard by which society prices labor, stores wealth, settles debt, and measures obligation. That is where this story becomes more than inflation. Rome did not begin to weaken only when enemies pressed at the edges. It began to weaken when the state discovered it could bend the measure of value from within. And once that possibility exists, a dangerous question enters history. If the state can quietly change the money, what exactly prevents it from doing so again? Around 211 BCE, in the violence of the Second Punic War, Rome introduced the denarius. That date matters, because this coin was not born in comfort. It was born in emergency. Rome was fighting for survival against Carthage, a rival power with wealth, reach, and military force strong enough to threaten the future of the Republic itself. Armies had to be raised, campaigns had to be financed, supplies had to move, men had to be paid. And in a world like that, money was never a secondary detail. It was part of the war machine. The denarius gave Rome something larger than a useful coin. It gave Rome a more stable way to organize force across distance. A soldier could be paid with it, a supplier could accept it,
A merchant could carry it. A state could build obligations around it. That is the deeper point. The denarius did not matter only because people could buy things with it. It mattered because it helped turn scattered effort into coordinated power. War requires trust. Not trust in peace, but trust under pressure. Trust that a payment made now will still hold value later. Trust that the state can meet its obligations. Trust that silver received in one place will still be accepted somewhere else. That is how money begins to shape society. Not only at the market stall, but in the camp, the road, the warehouse, the tax system, and the chain of command. The denarius helped Rome do more than spend. It helped Rome standardize, mobilize, concentrate power. And once that kind of money exists, it stops being just a coin. It becomes part of the foundation beneath the state itself.
The denarius became powerful for a reason. Not because Rome declared it important, not because a ruler said it was worth a certain amount, and not because ancient people were naive enough to trust a symbol without asking what stood behind it. They trusted it because the silver was there. That matters more than it may seem. In the ancient world, money was not primarily a promise. It was substance, weight, purity, metal that could be tested, handled, and compared. A Roman silver coin did not circulate simply because it bore authority. It circulated because people believed the authority and the metal still matched. That is what gave the denarius its strength. Its weight was relatively consistent. Its silver content was relatively dependable. And over time, that consistency allowed the coin to travel far beyond the place where it had been struck. A payment made in Italy could still be recognized in Spain. Silver accepted in a provincial market could still be trusted in a military camp. A merchant, a tax collector, a creditor, and a household could all work within the same monetary logic. That is how stable money begins to change society. It reduces friction between strangers. It shortens negotiation. It makes exchange faster, planning easier, and obligation more legible. A farmer could sell grain into a wider market. A merchant could move goods with less uncertainty. A soldier could be paid in something more reliable than local improvisation. A tax system could extract value more efficiently because value itself had become easier to recognize. The denarius did not erase distance, but it made distance easier to organize. And once enough people begin trusting the same money, that money becomes more than a medium of exchange. It becomes a shared language of value. That shared language helped Rome connect provinces that did not speak the same tongue, did not live under the same local customs, and did not produce the same goods. But they could still price, pay, collect, save, and settle within the same monetary frame. That is why stable money matters so much in history. It does not only help people buy things, it helps large societies coordinate. And in Rome, that coordination reached deep into daily life, into wages, into debt, into tax collection, into military supply, into trade across roads, ports, and frontiers. The denarius was strong because people trusted what was inside it. And because they trusted what was inside it, they were willing to build more of life around it. As Rome expanded, the denarius had to do more work, much more. A growing empire did not simply control more land. It inherited more obligations, more frontier lines to defend, more garrisons to supply, more roads to repair, more ports to secure, more governors, clerks, and tax officials to maintain, more grain to move from one region to another, more distance to hold together without letting the whole structure come apart. This is where imperial success begins to change its meaning. From a distance, expansion looks like strength.
On the inside, it often feels like cost. Every new province brought revenue, but it also brought exposure. Every conquest widened Rome's reach. It also widened the burden of keeping that reach real. An empire is not preserved by victory alone. Victory is the easy part to remember. What comes after is more expensive. Soldiers must remain at the border after the triumph ends. Roads must keep working after the banners come down. Officials must be paid in places far from Rome, in climates Rome did not choose, among populations Rome still needed to govern. And none of that can be done with glory. It has to be done with money. That is the pressure point. The more integrated Rome became, the more it depended on a financial system strong enough to carry military payrolls, tax transfers, infrastructure costs, and administrative obligations across enormous distance without breaking. This was no longer just a matter of commerce. It was a matter of state capacity. Could Rome still pay on time? Could it still move value from one end of the empire to the other? Could it still make soldiers, merchants, tax collectors, and provincial elites believe the system would hold? Because if that belief weakens, the problem is no longer confined to markets. It moves into command, into logistics, into loyalty. A highly integrated empire needs highly durable money, not merely to enrich itself, but to remain governable. And that is the deeper tension at the center of Rome's story. The empire grew stronger. Its financial burden grew heavier. Its obligations multiplied faster than its room for error. And once a state reaches that point, monetary stress is no longer a side effect of power. It becomes one of the conditions for keeping power alive.
The first break did not look like a break. That was the danger. Under Nero in the 1st century CE, Rome made a monetary decision that could easily have passed for a technical adjustment. The denarius still existed. The image still looked official. The coin still moved through the empire as money. And to most people at first, it probably seemed close enough to the same thing. But it was not the same thing. The silver content was reduced. Not enough to announce a crisis, not enough to stop the system overnight, just enough to create room. Room for the state to strike more coins from the same stock of metal. Room to ease fiscal pressure without openly confronting it. Room to postpone the harder choice. That is why this moment matters so much. Not because Nero destroyed Roman money in a single blow. He did not. It matters because Rome discovered something politically seductive and financially dangerous. It could preserve the appearance of stability while quietly weakening the substance beneath it. That is the pattern to watch in monetary history. The most consequential changes are often not the loud ones. They are the ones that arrive with familiar shapes and altered interiors. The denarius still looked like order. It still carried imperial authority in public. It still reassured the eye. But inside, the state had begun to trade honesty for flexibility. And that trade always feels manageable in the moment. A little less silver, a little more room to spend, a little less immediate strain on the treasury. That is the emotional logic of debasement. It offers relief before it reveals cost. For a government under pressure, that relief can feel rational, even prudent. Why raise taxes now if the mint can help? Why provoke unrest today if the coin can be adjusted quietly? Why choose pain in public when dilution can happen in silence? But that silence is exactly what makes the precedent so dangerous. Because once a state learns it can ease pressure by changing the money without changing the face of the money, the barrier has been crossed. The coin is no longer only a measure of value.
It becomes a tool for buying time. And time, in politics, is intoxicating. Nero's reduction in silver did not immediately shatter Roman society. Markets did not collapse in a day. Soldiers did not throw down their pay. Merchants did not suddenly stop trading. That is what made the decision survivable. And that is also what made it repeatable. The first reduction taught Rome a lesson it would not forget. The currency could be weakened without immediate ruin. From that point on, the danger was no longer confined to one emperor or one reform. It was built into the logic of the system itself. A small change had entered the coin, and with it, a much larger change had entered the empire.
Here is debasement works, and once you see the mechanism clearly, the temptation becomes obvious. A coin begins with a fixed amount of silver. Reduce that silver, even slightly, and the same stock of metal can now produce more coins than before. That is the opening move. Not more silver, not more real wealth, just more units. And those extra units matter because the state spends in coins, not in abstract theory. It pays soldiers in coins. It finances roads in coins. It settles obligations in coins. It moves power through whatever the mint can produce. So if each coin contains less silver, the government can stretch its metal further. From one reserve, it can strike a larger number of denarii. From a political point of view, that feels like relief. More payroll covered, more bills delayed, more pressure absorbed. At least for a while. This is the trap. Debasement can make the state feel richer without actually making the society richer. Because nothing new has been created except additional claims on the same underlying stock of value. The grain has not multiplied. The roads have not repaired themselves. The army has not become cheaper to maintain. The empire has not become easier to govern. Only the number of coins has changed. And once more coins begin chasing the same obligations, the difference has to emerge somewhere. At first, it may not appear dramatic. The coin still passes. The market still functions. Most people do not stop in the street and calculate metal ratios. But the logic is already in motion. The state has found a way to spend more today without taxing more today. It has borrowed room from the integrity of the currency itself. That is why debasement is not just a minting decision. It is a fiscal decision disguised as money. It allows the government to avoid an immediate confrontation with reality. No new levy announced, no public confession of weakness, no sudden admission that imperial costs are becoming harder to bear. Instead, the burden is pushed outward, quietly, into the coin, then into prices, then into trust. This is the system-level danger. If rulers can meet short-term needs by weakening money, then money stops functioning as a firm measure and starts functioning as a political shock absorber. And a shock absorber is useful precisely because it hides the full force of the impact. That is why debasement feels manageable in the beginning. It does not arrive as open collapse. It arrives as flexibility. A little less silver per coin. A few more coins in circulation. A little more room for the treasury to breathe. But that breathing room is purchased, not earned. Purchased with the future credibility of the currency. Purchased with the public's ability to trust that a coin tomorrow will mean what a coin meant yesterday. So the mechanism is simple. Less silver in each coin. More coins from the same metal.
One dominant
More
idea
state
is that
spending
debasement
without
feels manageable
immediate tax
because it
increases.
arrives as flexibility.
But the deeper truth is even simpler. Debasement does not create prosperity. It redistributes strain. And once a government learns it can do that, it has discovered one of the most dangerous comforts in monetary history. After Nero, debasement did not remain a one-time adjustment. It became a remembered option. That is how monetary deterioration usually deepens in history. Not when a state first discovers the trick, but when it discovers the trick can be used again. Once Rome had crossed that threshold, the mint no longer stood outside fiscal pressure. It became one of the ways fiscal pressure could be managed, and pressure kept growing. Because Rome did not stop expanding. It kept winning. It kept absorbing territory. It kept extending roads, borders, supply lines, and administrative reach. From the outside, this looked like imperial strength at its height. But success has a cost structure. Every military victory created new space to govern. Every new space to govern created new payrolls, new fortifications, new transport demands, new tax logistics, new layers of command. What had been conquest on one day became obligation the next. This is one of the central paradoxes of empire. Defeat is expensive, but victory can be expensive for longer. The empire gained land. It also gained permanence in its expenses. A frontier won in triumph had to be defended in routine. A province added to the map had to be administered in reality. A road celebrated as imperial achievement had to be maintained year after year in mud, heat, distance, and neglect. And all of that meant one thing: more money, more often. That is why Nero's precedent mattered so much. It did not merely reduce silver in a coin. It expanded the imagination of the state. It suggested that when ordinary revenues were not enough, the currency itself could absorb the strain.
Place the new stone
Not
here.
forever, not cleanly,
Ensure the drainage
but
is
quietly
clear.
enough to remain tempting. And temptation hardens into habit when it keeps appearing to work. Each time fiscal pressure tightened, the logic returned. A little more flexibility at the mint, a little less immediate pain in taxation, a little more room to meet payroll, cover military
Nero's
needs,
precedent
and preserve
mattered
the appearance
because
of
it
control.
expanded the imagination
What
of the
began
state.
as a break in monetary honesty risked becoming part of administrative reflex. That is how a precedent becomes a system. Not through dramatic declaration, through repetition. And repetition matters because it changes the relationship between empire and money. The coin is no longer just supporting the state. It is being asked to
One
conceal
dominant
the
idea
growing
is a
cost
little more
of the state.
flexibility at the mint.
This
a little
is where
less
the deeper
immediate pain
burden
in
of Roman
taxation.
success begins to appear. Success did not remove pressure. It redistributed pressure into a larger machine that had to be fed constantly. Rome had become stronger. Its obligations had become heavier. Its victories had enlarged the very structure whose costs were now becoming harder to bear. Success created its own burden. And when a state learns to answer that burden by weakening money, the danger is no longer a single reform. It is the beginning of a habit the empire may keep reaching for, precisely because it cannot easily afford the truth. After Marcus Aurelius, the problem was no longer only monetary. It became political. The empire entered a period of deep instability. Not one shock, but a chain of them. Emperors rose quickly and fell violently. Civil wars multiplied. Border provinces came under growing pressure from outside enemies, and the authority of the center began to thin. This is where the story changes. Before, a weakened coin could still be discussed as a financial decision. A dangerous one, yes, but still a decision inside the machinery of government. Now, the machinery itself was beginning to fail. When emperors can be replaced by force, money changes meaning. It is no longer just a medium of payment or a standard of value. In the 3rd century, money was no longer only trying to hold markets together. It was trying to hold the throne together. That is the shift. Once imperial succession became unstable, the Roman army stopped being only the instrument of power. It became the judge of power. And when soldiers become the men who decide who rules, money changes its function again. It is no longer enough for coin to circulate. It has to persuade. A claimant to the throne did not need abstract legitimacy first. He needed loyalty fast. He needed legions willing to back him before a rival commander bought their obedience instead. That kind of loyalty was never sustained by speeches alone. It had to be paid. Regular wages mattered, but in crisis, regular wages were not enough. Emperors and usurpers alike had to promise more than routine pay. Bonuses, donatives, exceptional rewards for exceptional allegiance. And every one of those promises had to be met in coin. This is where monetary history becomes brutally human. A soldier standing on a frontier did not care about elegant theories of fiscal policy. He cared whether his pay still fed his household. A general marching on the capital did not need a perfect constitutional claim. He needed enough silver to make his army believe that following him would be worth the risk. A ruler sitting uneasily on the throne did not need stability in the abstract. He needed time. And coin could buy time, at least for a while. That is why the army became the center of the monetary story. Not because soldiers caused inflation by themselves, but because once military loyalty became the decisive currency of politics, the pressure to produce money intensified dramatically. Every civil conflict raised the price of allegiance. Every contested succession made delay more dangerous. Every emperor knew that unpaid troops were not simply a budget problem. They were a regime problem. And once that is true, money stops functioning merely as a medium of exchange or a unit of account. It becomes fuel for immediate political survival. That changes everything. Because the state is no longer minting only to govern an empire. It is minting to prevent the empire's armed core from turning against it. The throne, the army, and the coin become tied together in a tightening loop. Pay the troops to keep power, debase the coin to keep paying them. Weaken the money that the rest of society depends on. Then depend even more on the troops when society grows less stable. This is one of the darkest turns in Rome's monetary history. Money was no longer just helping organize order. It was being pulled into the violent contest over who had the right to command that order in the first place. Then came a coin that revealed the logic more openly. The Antoninianus. Under Caracalla, Rome introduced a new coin that was supposed to be worth more than the denarius. In official terms, it carried a higher nominal value. In metallic terms, it did not carry a proportionate increase in silver. That difference is the reveal. Because by this point, Rome was no longer merely shaving value inside an old monetary form. It was constructing a new form that made the gap harder to ignore. The face of authority was still there. The claim of value was still there. The public language of legitimacy was still there. But the substance underneath was slipping further away from the promise above it. Same face, weaker substance. That is what the Antoninianus represented. Not just another coin, but a system speaking more loudly than before. It said the state still needed money to look trustworthy, even when it could no longer afford to make that trust fully real in metal. And that matters, because money does not fail only when it becomes visibly worthless.
It begins failing when appearance and substance stop moving together. The Antoninianus made that fracture harder to hide. Officially, Rome could declare greater value. Practically, people still had to ask what was actually inside the coin. And once that question enters circulation, the damage is no longer confined to metal content. It enters behavior. Merchants begin looking harder. Soldiers begin expecting more. Payments begin to feel less final. The state begins relying even more heavily on nominal claims to bridge a widening gap in real value. This is why the Antoninianus sits at such a dangerous point in the story.
That doesn't seem right.
It is
Let
the
me start
moment
over.
when
1,
monetary
2,
weakening
3.
becomes more visible, more ambitious, and more revealing of the system behind it. A healthy currency does not need to overstate itself. A stressed one often does. And Rome was stressed. The empire still wanted the authority of silver, still wanted the reach of silver, still wanted the obedience that silver could buy. But it was becoming less able to support those demands honestly. So the coin changed again, not by abandoning imperial dignity on the surface, but by preserving the surface while hollowing out the depth. The Antoninianus was not just a monetary instrument. It was a confession in metal, a confession that Rome still needed the image of strong money, even as the substance of strong money was becoming harder to maintain.
Inflation did not begin as an announcement. It began as behavior.
The price has gone up.
A merchant who
Must be more
once
than
accepted
this.
a coin at a
All right,
glance now stopped to weigh it. A seller asked for more. A buyer hesitated longer before paying. That is how weakening money enters society.
Yes. Thank you,
Not
Honour
first
Defender.
through theory, but through caution. People did not need economic language to feel the change. They could feel that silver no longer meant exactly what it used to mean. So the market adjusted. Merchants trusted metal more than the emperor's face. Transactions slowed. Prices rose, not only from greed, but from self-protection. Buyers became more guarded because every payment carried more doubt. Gold began to look safer than silver, and in some places, barter returned. Goods for goods, labor for supplies, food for tools. That is the deeper damage. A weaker currency does not only raise prices, it changes habits. It adds friction. It makes ordinary exchange more defensive. The market still exists, but the ease is gone.
This is where inflation becomes a cycle. More weakened coins enter circulation. Prices rise.
Soldiers and workers need higher pay just to stand still. The state now faces larger obligations in money that is buying less. So it returns to the mint, and the loop tightens. That is why inflation is so dangerous to a large state. It does not only make life more expensive, it makes government less capable. Taxes still come in, but they arrive in currency that no longer holds the same purchasing power. On paper, revenue exists. In practice, it buys less grain, less labor, less loyalty, less time. That distortion matters, because Rome was not just funding markets. It was funding armies, roads, administration, supply lines, and imperial control across distance. As money weakened, the state had to spend more just to maintain yesterday's level of order. So the problem stopped being monetary in a narrow sense. It became administrative, political, imperial. A weaker currency raised prices. Rising prices raised pay demands. Higher pay demands forced more minting. And more minting weakened the currency again. That is the spiral. Not a single collapse, but a system slowly losing the capacity to hold itself together.
At this stage, Rome was no longer facing only a crisis of prices.
it was facing a crisis of order. When money loses credibility, a state loses more than purchasing power. It loses coordination. Taxes become harder to collect in meaningful terms. Military pay still goes out, but it reaches soldiers with less force than before. Markets stay open, yet they grow more defensive. Local authorities begin solving problems on their own because the center feels slower, weaker, less reliable. That is the deeper damage. An empire survives at scale by turning obligation into routine. Taxes are paid, supplies move, officials obey, soldiers wait, merchants trust settlement. When money weakens, that routine begins to fray. And once routine frays, power thins. Some trade slips into unofficial channels. Some goods disappear from formal exchange. Some people stop trusting the state's money and start trusting whatever still feels solid. This is no longer only economics. It is social order decaying through money. The state still stands. The empire still exists. But more of society is beginning to operate with one quiet assumption. The center may no longer be able to hold everything together.
By the time Diocletian acted, Rome was no longer trying to prevent inflation.
It was trying to overpower it. His most famous response was the Edict on Maximum Prices, an attempt to force ceilings onto goods, wages, and services across the empire. The logic was simple. If prices were rising, command them not to rise. But that was never the real wound. A government can threaten merchants. It can punish sellers. It can announce limits with imperial authority. What it cannot do is make weak money strong by decree. If the coin still loses trust, price controls do not restore order. They drive trade into hiding. Goods disappear. Unofficial exchange expands. Fear replaces settlement. That is why the policy failed. It treated inflation as disobedience, when the deeper problem was credibility. Constantine's response was different. Instead of trying to command confidence, he tried to rebuild it. The Solidus, with more dependable gold content, offered something Rome had been losing for generations: monetary trust that did not need to be forced. That is the payoff. One response tried to coerce the market. The other tried to give the market a reason to believe again. And in monetary history, belief lasts longer than fear.
Today, money no longer arrives as silver in the hand. It arrives as paper, screens, entries, signals. But the temptation behind it is not as modern as it looks. When states face debt, war, unrest, or slowing growth, the pressure is familiar. Find room, delay pain, avoid the harder admission. And money still offers that temptation. Not always as open abuse, sometimes as management, sometimes as rescue, sometimes as policy that works for a while. That is why Rome still matters. Not because our world is identical to theirs, but because the underlying risk has not disappeared. A society can live with expensive government. It can live with conflict. It can even live with weak leadership for longer than people expect. What it struggles to survive is a slow fracture in monetary trust. The real crisis begins before shelves are empty, before panic, before collapse. It begins when enough people quietly stop being sure that money is still what it used to be. And once that doubt enters daily life, the system may still stand, but it no longer stands the same way.